By George, I did it! I did it! I did it! Ah! Hello, beautiful bookworms. Grab yourself a cup of tea or something yummy and join me as I celebrate ticking off a life goal that I've had lurking around since I was a teenager. I just recorded an hour and 20 minutes before I realized I never hit the record button. So this will be fun. I do hope my voice holds out. We are recording. We are recording? Yes, we are recording. Let's do it! Before I go any further, I want to state very clearly that in the real world, the number of books you read doesn't really matter. Especially when one compares oneself to others online. Some of the booktubers I follow regularly read well over 100, even 200 books a year, and I know within myself that's just not something I'm capable of doing. Realistically, I read somewhere between 20 and 50 books a year, but last year I read 13! It completely depends. And I'm the type of person who loves doing a wide range of things. Reading is just one. But this year I set out to read 100 books in a year as a specific challenge because it has been a fun, silly goal of mine for ages. This here is my life goals list. It is more comprehensive and less weighty than a bucket list. Really, anything that pops into my head that is something I might like to do at some point in my life goes in here. From big, lofty, probably unachievable goals to the tiniest and silliest of experiences. It's got various reading goals, film watching goals, skills to learn, travel and adventure goals both near and far, all sorts of things. Some that have even dropped off my list over time, but that I can look back and reflect upon the person I was when I set those goals. I am a person who likes lists, so I think this just tickles a part of my psyche when I accomplish something that I can cross off my life goals list. But I do owe the original idea to my favorite teacher in high school, Mrs. Ensign. In, I think, 2007, she had us write 50 life goals on a sheet of paper and put it in an envelope, and then she mailed it to us 1 year later as an exercise of goal setting and reflection. But for me, it stuck. Being the overachiever I was, my original list was 80 life goals, and after receiving my list back, I held on to it and transferred it into a journal, where it continued to expand. Later on, I revised my journal to be slightly more bullet journal-esque, with visuals to color in, like bookshelves and maps, where I can view my progress on certain goals. I think my life goals number somewhere in the 800s currently. But if I turn to the very first page of my life goals list, you will see number 11 is read 100 books in a year. So I decided in January that 2025 would be the year I achieved this goal. Now, it is admittedly not my first attempt, but I liked the idea of 2025 as a nice round number being the year, so I really buckled down. And because it's my arbitrary goal, I pulled out all the short books in my library I'd been meaning to read. Poetry, plays, short stories, etc., and got to it. As long as I had a decent number of proper length books in there as well. I mentioned reading goals throughout my life goals list. I have many different lists in here of books that I started including as a way to expand what I was reading and catch up on loads of important and classic books I never read in school. And as some of the books I read this year are on those lists, I will be mentioning those throughout the video. But currently, my life goals include reading every book on Time Magazine's all-time 100 English novels list, reading or seeing performed the complete works of Shakespeare, reading the entire Bible, reading the complete Sherlock Holmes collection, reading the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which I've completed, reading the 100 books on BBC's The Big Read list, reading every Jane Austen book, reading the Chronicles of Narnia, reading every Booker Prize winning book, reading every Pulitzer Prize for Fiction winning book, reading Oprah's original book club picks, reading every book that inspired a Disney film, reading everything on Susan Wise Bower's Well-Educated Mind list, collecting and reading the first 1,000 Penguin books, reading all books referenced in the film The Pagemaster, and reading all books referenced in the book Matilda. Will I read all of those in my lifetime? Almost assuredly not. But this is what I mean when I say my life goals list isn't as weighty as a bucket list. I enjoy tracking progress just as much as ticking off a goal as complete. And again, a lot of those lists are more for me to keep in mind the possibilities of my next read beyond the types of books I would naturally gravitate toward. With all that said, let's get into what I read in 2025. The first thing I read, which funnily enough isn't actually being counted as it's only a poem, is The Belfry of Bruges by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I read this following a weekend trip my friends and I took to Bruges, Belgium, early in January, where we in fact climbed the Belfry. The poem was mentioned on a plaque inside, so I made a note and read it when I came home. The first book I read was via audiobook, Strong Female Character by Scottish comedian Fern Brady. I actually listened to this twice this year. I don't particularly follow comedians, but I had a massive marathon of watching Taskmaster and was introduced to Fern and others through that, but I have come to really enjoy her comedy as well. Then I found out that Fern has made public that she is autistic, diagnosed in adulthood, and heard that she'd written a memoir about her life with a heavy emphasis on her experience living with autism. Last year I had read The Reason I Jump by Naoki Higashida, so this felt like a natural progression from a train of reading I was already on. I really appreciated her candor and her willingness to discuss things like meltdowns, which are typically downplayed, but I especially appreciated hearing the perspective of a late diagnosed female with autism and the difficulties in being diagnosed as a woman. Even if you don't know anyone in your life with autism, I feel this is one of those books that is great to generally better understand our fellow human beings on this planet. The second book I read was Vicky Angel by Jacqueline Wilson. I had in mind to read some Wilson books this year because 1, I did not read them growing up, and 2, these titles specifically were on BBC's The Big Read list, life goal number 485. This one deals with the loss of a friend in childhood, the grieving process, but also how one's memory of a lost loved one shifts after their death, and how that can mess with one's head. As my first Jacqueline Wilson, I thought it was very poignant, but in a way that would make sense for the younger audience for which she writes. Wilson to me is like the British Judy Blume. Book number 3 is The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. I read this via audiobook. It is on the Well-Educated Mind reading list, life goal 711. And despite its emphasis on the suppression of women in 20th century America, I found this book to actually be much more broadly relevant, not only to today, but some key points can be extrapolated to other subjects. For instance, it discusses how in any rights movements, the loudest, most extreme, most obnoxious voices are the ones given the spotlight in the media, which benefits those who don't want the movement to succeed, those in positions of power who stand to gain, likely financially, from maintaining the status quo. The reasons why certain people wanted to keep women unequal are the same reasons why similar people opposed the end of slavery. The other thing that surprised me is how problems facing men are also discussed. Yes, it largely focuses on women's issues, but true feminism to me, and to Friedan, is about elevating everyone to a place where they can be free to express themselves and pursue what is meaningful to them. And that absolutely applies to men as well. And of course, non-binary people. Book number 4 is Crossing the Water, a poetry collection by Sylvia Plath. I read a few Plath items this year, starting with this. The first time I read Plath's poetry, I'll be honest, I just didn't get it. I appreciated how she used language, especially with her use of metaphor, but the meaning went right over my head. This collection, I felt I could soak in a bit more, and I really loved when that did happen. But I'm still working on being able to read poetry, not just more, but better, more in depth, taking my time with each poem. I imagine I'll be revisiting Plath's poetry along that journey, but so far this is the collection I can connect with the best. Book number 5 was Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. I believe I did a combination of reading and audiobooking on this one, but mostly physical reading. It's funny how one can be exposed to elements and characters of classic books in younger life, but never actually read those books. This was one of those for me. And this book caused me to add life goal number 796, read every book referenced in the film The Page Master, to my list. I found this book very enjoyable, very readable, and Long John Silver was a much more morally grey, nuanced character than I always assumed him to be, having mainly seen him as this sort of cartoonish villain. Yeah, It was fun. And if anyone hasn't seen The Page Master, it is one of my favorite early 90s nostalgic films all about books and the magic of reading. It is a mix of live action and animation and stars Macaulay Culkin and Christopher Lloyd, with voice actors also including Whoopi Goldberg, Patrick Stewart, and Leonard Nimoy. Book number 6 was another audiobook, not one I intended on reading, but it was recommended to me by Audible after I finished my previous audiobook driving home in the car where I wasn't in a position to change it. And I enjoyed the preview so much that I then read the whole thing. So, well done, Audible. Unruly by David Mitchell, the ridiculous history of England's kings and queens. This covers King Arthur, spoiler alert, he didn't exist, goes through the pre-Norman kings of Anglo-Saxon England, and of course reaches William the Conqueror, covering all of the counted monarchs of England up through Elizabeth I, at which point Mitchell states that enough has been said and written about the rest. I probably wouldn't have read this as a book personally, but as David Mitchell narrated this himself, I very much enjoyed listening to his British comic nerd take on monarchical history. I laughed a lot. It's not a serious history book, but it does have real history in it. Not like Kunk, which I'll get to more later. I also wasn't expecting so much of it to be focused on the pre-Norman monarchs. Very enjoyable if you want a bit of history mixed with comedy. Book number 7, A Child's Garden of Verses by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is a classic collection of children's poetry I thought was on the whole delightful. Aside from one really rather outdated, out of touch, frankly racist poem, and I don't say that lightly. But aside from that one poem, the rest was really sweet. I don't always like older children's poetry, but this one I feel still holds up for very young children. Book number 8 was Why I Write by George Orwell. This is a short collection of essays starting with Orwell's attitude and experience toward writing itself, but then it largely covers the political motivations that urged him into writing and gives a very present account of how he viewed the state of the world in the mid-1940s. This was written a few years before 1984 was published, which was especially interesting when he writes about being unsure he'll ever write anything truly meaningful. Very quick read, and for fans of 1984, I think a great behind the scenes into the brain that created it. Book number 9 was Peter and Alice by John Logan. This is a play I'd been wanting to read for years, which speculated on what was said during a real-life meeting between Alice Liddell and Peter Llewellyn Davis, the people who, as children, inspired Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Peter Pan. Alice at this time is 80 and Peter is in his 30s, and throughout this dramatized conversation, they compare and contrast their experiences, being forever seen as these fictional characters. We get flashbacks into their childhoods and glimpses of their fictional alter egos, so it's very atmospheric at times. I really wish I had a chance to see the play itself, which starred Dame Judi Dench and Ben Whishaw, but alas, I was not yet living here in 2013. Maybe one day it will come back to the West End. Book number 10 was White Nights by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. I saw this recommended by Jack Edwards, and as it was a short story, I immediately ordered it to add it to my reading stack for the year. I had not yet read any Dostoyevsky, although I have a few tomes sitting in my library waiting for me, but I was intrigued to use this as my first dip into his writing. It does make me want to read more, so that bodes well. The story is about ideas of love and this sudden relationship that forms between these two people. One who lives his life as no more than a spectator, really, but yearns to prove that he can live in the real world and be someone's everything. And another who is battling through confusion and heartbreak following what she believes is being abandoned by her true love. I don't think I liked the story quite as much as Jack did, but I did like the writing. I struggled with the main character though, because he was very sympathetic, but his eagerness also came across a bit icky in the context of today's culture of the disheartened good guys who end up being quite destructive when they don't get what they think they're entitled to. And that's not me purposefully judging this by modern standards, but I can't help my reaction reading something in my own present context. As a study of the complexities of human emotions, though, I thought it was good. Book number 11 was one of my favorites of the year, The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. This was one of those rare books that made me resent everything else going on in my life because all I wanted to do was sit and read this book. It's such a classic gothic spooky tale, so engaging. I had already seen the 2012 film with Daniel Radcliffe, which is a modernized version of this story, greatly upping the spooky jump scare factor. But after reading the book, I also watched the 1989 TV film, which, fun fact, stars the actor who played James Potter, Harry's father, in the Harry Potter films. The 1989 version was much closer to the book and far less scary, but all three, the book and the two films, had major differences, particularly with the ending. And to me, all three of them worked in their different ways. But the thing I like about the book, which completely sets it apart from both films, and if you've seen either of them, this will make more sense, is that the book is the main character's own account of what happened to him, written in hindsight after his children asked him to tell him a ghost story one Christmas evening. Being inside his mind, but also knowing that he ultimately survives it all from the beginning, gives the book its own special quality. Tea break! Book number 12 was Night by Elie Wiesel. Not sure why I didn't read this in school, but it is a first-person account of being a Jew in the Holocaust. I'm not going to say much beyond that, except this really should be required reading. Dehumanizing fellow human beings will be the destruction of us all. Number 13 was The Book of Secrets by Derren Brown. For those of you who aren't familiar, Derren Brown is best known as a mentalist magician in the UK, but he has also written a few books about philosophy and the concept of happiness. I've already read and recommended Happy, although there was a shorter key points version titled A Little Happier. And this, The Book of Secrets, is intended to follow on from those, covering topics he felt he missed. But equally, it can be read entirely separately and still give one lots to think about. Its subtitle is Finding Solace in a Stubborn World, and it discusses how counterintuitive a lot of our beliefs about ourselves can be, how our political opinions aren't as hard, fast, or rational as we think, and in fact can be manipulated quite easily by triggering key emotions, the importance of embracing ambiguity and nuance and the dangers of asserting certainty, how mental friction is a necessity just like physical friction keeps our bodies strong, because facing challenging ideas helps us grow. So all the modern conveniences designed to reduce friction and increase efficiency and convenience while instinctively feel good actually do us harm. These ideas and more are examined in The Book of Secrets. This is going in my list of top non-fiction books. I did mostly audiobook this one. It is narrated by Derren Brown himself, and I enjoy listening to his voice, but I dipped into my copy of the book many times to write down notes and quotes and revisit key points along the way. My copy is also a signed copy I ordered when it first came out. Book number 14 was The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. As I said, I was on a bit of a Plath path this year. The Bell Jar is her only novel, and it is a semi-autobiographical account of her decline into mental illness in her early 20s after leaving school and taking part in an internship in New York. It's a really bittersweet story because it ends with hope and optimism. The stuffiness of the bell jar enclosing her world has been lifted, but of course she acknowledges that it can return at any time. I wanted to tell her that if only something were wrong with my body, it would be fine. I would rather have anything wrong with my body than something wrong with my head, but the idea seemed so involved and wearisome that I didn't say anything. I only burrowed down further in the bed. Which is all the more harrowing knowing that only a month after its publication, Plath took her own life. I want to say things are much better with regards to mental health considerations and treatment, but I'm sure we have a long way to go. Book number 15 was On Deception by Harry Houdini. I have a small collection of books relating to magicians and conjuring, which blends into a further collection centered around skepticism, and I thought this book would fit into that, knowing Houdini personally quested to expose false mediums and spiritualists after being hurt by them following the death of his mother. But this book isn't really what I thought it would be. It was more just kind of talking through the tricks of the trade with various spectacle performers like fellow inferior escapologists, fire eaters, sword swallowers, etc. It wasn't really what I was interested in, but it did have a nice introduction by Derren Brown. Book number 16 was Voices of the Night by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I actually have a complete collection of Longfellow's works, but I only read those from this collection. Again, I'm trying to expand my poetry reading, and after I read The Belfry of Bruges at the beginning of the year, I decided to pick through some more. I don't have much to say on it though. His writings on nature can be really lovely. Book number 17 was The Hunting of the Snark by Lewis Carroll. This is an 8-part nonsense poem which borrows a bit from Jabberwocky, another nonsense poem featured in Through the Looking Glass. The narrative follows a crew of 10 trying to hunt the Snark, a creature which may turn out to be the highly dangerous Boojum. Carroll himself never asserted any meaning for the poem, but he apparently did agree with one reader's interpretation as an allegory for the search for happiness. Book number 18 was another Sylvia Plath poetry collection, Ariel. Again, despite taking this slowly, I am going to need to revisit this at some point. Her mental agony toward the end of her life is clear, and much like Van Gogh, the artistry of her words is astounding as a result, but I do still find it difficult to really dig into some of the poems and fully understand them. At the same time, poetry for me sometimes isn't about fully understanding every word and meaning, but rather evoking an emotion. There's a saying in musical theater, as emotions grow more intense in a storyline, that if speaking isn't enough to convey an emotion, a character will sing, and when song isn't sufficient, they dance. Sometimes poetry for me is the dancing phase of a musical, and with Plath's it certainly is. Even though it is comprised of words, sometimes it can't be explained by words. Book number 19 was another audiobook, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking by Suzanne Cain. Another book I had been meaning to read for years and years. It discusses in depth the spectrum of extroversion to introversion, with a lot of focus on introverts, because while 1/3 to 1/2 of Americans are introverts, American culture largely prizes extroversion because of the history of American business. And yes, this book is largely American focused, but it does contrast that with other cultural mindsets as well. Throughout the book, there are some questionnaires so you can better understand where you sit on the spectrum, not only of extroversion or introversion, but also whether your brain has high or low reactivity, which plays a part in the balance of our old brain, where our base instincts for fear, excitement, reward, etc. exist as they have in our ancestors over thousands of years, versus our new brain, those areas responsible for thinking, planning, language, and decision-making, which have developed more recently. This is another one going on my list of favorite nonfiction books. People are different, and it's very hard for us humans to fully comprehend that, let alone accept it. And any book that helps us with that understanding is one I am going to recommend. Book number 20 was Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. In 2024, my husband and I visited Amiens, France, and toured Jules Verne's house. And I hadn't realized until then that Around the World in 80 Days was really the one that took off and brought him fame initially, so I decided to read it. The 2004 film starring Steve Coogan and Jackie Chan is also one of my husband's nostalgic go-tos, even though it is nothing at all like the book, aside from the basic plot idea. The book, I found, was actually quite uneventful for the majority of the story, as it's literally just Phileas Fogg nonchalantly moving from one train to another, seeing nothing of the world he's traversing, much to the astonishment of his valet Passepartout. As certain hiccups inevitably interrupt the journey, Fogg carries on, completely unconcerned as he throws money around to navigate solutions. It does pick up a bit more in the later portion, and of course the twist ending is exciting, but it's always funny reading something that has grown over time to seem more exciting than it really was. But also knowing that when it was originally published, in 1873 in this case, the story genuinely was that exciting. I feel like humans acclimate far too easily and ruin our own sense of joy. Book number 21 was The Theory of Relativity by Albert Einstein. I audiobooked this one. It was only about 2 hours long. I am not going to pretend like I understood everything. The terminology sounded familiar from school and my maths degree, but that's now 13 years behind me. I don't remember everything specifically aside from E=mc², but the main thing I did enjoy was being immersed into a time when these concepts and theories were novel, when certain facts of the universe we now take for granted were first worked out, and listening to why previous explanations were now found to be incorrect, as I'm sure some things in the book have since been improved upon as well. Knowing that science is constantly working to improve our understanding of the universe is one thing, but hearing it in the context of a specific moment of that understanding made that effort feel more grounded and real. I also got to check it off my well-educated mind reading list. Book number 22 was The Daughter of Time by Josephine, recommended to me by a friend. I don't typically read murder mysteries, but this is no typical murder mystery. The Daughter of Time is a 1951 detective fiction novel, the last one Tay published before her death, which stars recurring character Scotland Yard Inspector Alan Grant. But there are no dramatic scenes, no chases, no imminent threat even. Just nerdy academic reasoning and deduction with an increasingly energetic discussion that those of us who have experienced diving down a deep rabbit hole know all too well. It's also great for fans of English history because the subject of Grant's investigation is none other than King Richard III. The premise is this. While Grant is recovering from a broken leg and bored out of his mind staring at the ceiling in the hospital, his actress friend suggests he research an historic mystery to give him something to do. With a keen interest in human faces, he has brought pictures of historic characters and gravitates toward this portrait of King Richard III. Something about this portrait doesn't match up with the stories of cruelty and murder made famous by Thomas More and Shakespeare. Together with an American researcher, Brent Carradine, who works in the British Museum and is able to be Grant's personal researcher in the matter, Grant uses his detective logic to determine whether Richard III did in fact kill his two nephews in the Tower of London, or whether his alleged crimes were all merely Tudor propaganda after his death. This book could have been written as a strong non-fiction argument for the rewriting of history, but it's written as a novel, so instead of being lectured at, we get to feel like we're part of the discussion. It was a bit slow to get into, and I ended up switching from the physical book to the audiobook midway through, but once I got over that initial expositional hurdle, my brain connected with this really well. I got giddy with excitement with each new revelation on the road to truth. The Daughter of Time, as the old proverb goes. Also, the audiobook I listened to was narrated by Derek Jacobi, who is just a legend. Book number 23 was the first of 3 books I had pre-ordered to read this year. Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins. This is a prequel to the Hunger Games trilogy focusing on Hamish Abernathy's participation in the 50th Hunger Games, the second quarterquell. Now, in 2024, in anticipation of this book coming out, I reread the original trilogy and read for the first time The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. All of them are important to Sunrise on the Reaping, with many references and interweaving characters, so if you haven't read or need a refresher on any of the previous books, I do recommend visiting those first to get the full experience of Sunrise, particularly Catching Fire and Ballad. The lore of Panem, the depth of the characters and how they connect with each other, and the evolution of the Hunger Games over time are all strong in this book. Hamish's story is incredibly heartbreaking, which I don't think is spoiling anything really, as we all know how he is when he first meets Katniss and Peeta. This book shows how he got to be like that, but there is a wonderful little epilogue as well that bookends his story after the war. I loved this book. I have no criticisms. I love this franchise. I can't wait for the film of this to be made. I can't wait for the next book to be written. Can I personally request Mags's Games next? Pretty please. Actually, we need more on Plutarch Heavensbee as well. Book number 24 was an unexpected read. This book was written in complete secrecy, and for good reason. Careless People, a story of where I used to work by Sarah Wynne-Williams, is a whistleblower first-hand account of her time working at Facebook as an executive in global policy. She self-narrates the audiobook, which is how I read this, and holy crap! I knew Facebook was dangerous and toxic. I had coincidentally only a month or 2 before this came out deleted my account after nearly 20 years on the platform because it was horrible for my mental health. But I had no idea just how truly evil the company is. It starts off feeling like a Devil Wears Prada memoir but in the tech world, and becomes a terrifying and frankly depressing look at just who is really running the world. Ironically enough, the company purporting to be the advocates of the freest of free speech immediately stopped Wynne-Williams from giving interviews upon the book's release. But the sheer apathy of a group of people with unlimited wealth and power who treat the world like a board game, only questing to acquire more for more's sake, blatantly lying to the public and world leaders in sheer disregard for actual human lives, is sickening. And look, there are some really great things that come with Facebook and other social media platforms. There is a reason I had mine for so long. I do still have Instagram, also owned by Meta, but I use it very sparingly and intentionally as a tool with full awareness of the dangers it poses. If you don't want to be potentially talked out of using a tool which has brought you joy, connected you with long-lost friends or relatives, or if you just don't want to put your mental health at risk by learning about more billionaires treating you like nothing more than pawns in their game, I get it. Feel free to avoid this book. I think the documentary The Social Dilemma puts the point across just as well, because keep in mind the people who create these social media platforms often don't use them themselves and strictly prevent their children from using them. But this book is important if you can handle it. It is important to know how we are actively being manipulated. If this does not stop, a handful of people will destroy the world. Because they can, and they don't care. And with that, I need to move on for my own mental health. Book number 25 is The Hive by Anna February. This is a new book which came out in April, the second of my 2025 pre-orders, and it was such a fantastically enjoyable read. It was a perfect follow-up to Sunrise on the Reaping, as it also is a YA dystopian novel with similar Hunger Games-esque themes of the society which is supposedly built to keep everyone safe being discovered for what it truly is. Heinously unequal and treating its constituents at every level as dispensable for the good of the few who make it to the top. But it is layered with an excellently crafted high-stakes murder mystery that twists and turns and keeps you guessing to the end. It also has a touch of fantasy and a touch of romance in the best, most refreshingly healthy way. The story is set in a future world where sea levels have risen dramatically, in which a community survives on an island, formerly a mountain peak, in an underground structure called the Hive. The physical structure, as well as the structure of society, is based upon that of bees, now merely mythical creatures. All must work for the good of the Hive, and sacrifices are expected to be made for the good of the royal family and the apex that governs them. Royals are protected by shields, people who are bonded to them from birth and raised to protect them, because if their charge dies, so do they, automatically. The main character, Feldspar, is one of these shields, but when her charge, a future queen, is murdered, and she survives, she is suspected of having turned on her charge and sentenced to be executed. She has only a few days to clear her name and find out what is really happening in the Hive. Together with an unexpected ally, Nico, a member of the royal family himself, Feldspar's eyes are opened to the reality of the community in which she lives, and that it can be changed. The two main characters are incredibly likable, but also written very natural and human with layers and complexity. Every aspect of this book, the storyline, the pacing, the character development, the world building, the suspense, and the underlying message of the importance of knowledge, science, and individual autonomy were really well developed. For full transparency, the reason I know about this book is because it was written by my sister-in-law, who has previously written adult fantasy novels under the name A.F.E. Smith. But honestly and unbiasedly, this was one of my favorite reads this year. Number 26 was a short story by Herman Melville called Bartleby the Scrivener. This was recommended by Ruby Granger, along with a few others coming up, in her video on psychological classics. It was a slight struggle to get into with the language Melville uses. I had to look up several archaic words along the way, so I ended up reading a good portion of it again, but once I got into it, I found it actually quite hilarious. The story is told from the perspective of Bartleby's employer, who is recalling essentially the strangest person he's ever come across, and yet knows nothing about aside from his direct experience working with him. Bartleby is hired on Wall Street as a scrivener to copy out legal documents. This was written in 1853, so before typewriters, when everything would have been copied by hand. He's an incredibly industrious worker, but anytime the narrator asks him to help out with some other office task, Bartleby calmly responds, "I would prefer not to." His boss and colleagues get increasingly frustrated with this, but every time his boss is determined to do something about it, he gets thrown off his quest by Bartleby's bizarre manner and feels guilty when he realizes Bartleby seems to actually be living at the office and doesn't seem to have anyone in his life. But then things get even more bizarre when Bartleby decides he would prefer not to copy anymore and simply remains standing in the office, staring out the window, at the brick wall that is the next building. I won't go further, but it is a short story that I think requires more time to read because of the language, but it is a very interesting and quirky story of human eccentricity and the psychology of responding to something we don't understand. Number 27 is another short story recommended by Ruby Granger, although I had read this in audiobook form previously. The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I wanted to reread it physically anyway. Gilman was actually quite a prolific writer in her lifetime, but this one late 19th century short story is now the main thing she is known by. It is about a woman who is suffering from temporary nervous depression, but isn't taken seriously. So her doctor husband rents them a mansion so she can undergo a rest cure, which is something women were often subjected to for their hysteria, comprising of physical and mental isolation and inactivity until they just felt better. In the story, the main character is tucked away into what was previously a nursery with this hideous, partially ripped away yellow wallpaper with a convoluted design that she spends increasingly more time studying until she ultimately descends into total madness. Seeing a figure of a woman creeping behind the so-called bars of the wallpaper's design, trying to get out. It's such a disturbing but captivating tale, based on Gilman's own personal experience with postpartum depression. In fact, about 20 years after this story was published, Gilman explained in Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, also included in this edition, that it was a direct protest against the treatment she herself underwent, recommended by a noted specialist in the field to live as domestic a life as far as possible, to have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and never to touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as she lived. The advice, taken over merely a few months, brought her, quote, so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that I could see over. But she saw fit to reject the advice thereafter and get back to work. Work. The normal life of every human being. Work in which is joy and growth and service, without which one is a pauper and a parasite, ultimately recovering some measure of power. She wrote The Yellow Wallpaper not to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy. And it worked. She sent a copy of her story to the very physician who nearly drove her mad. And while he never acknowledged it directly, she found out later that he altered his treatment practices, admittedly because of the yellow wallpaper. Number 28 is Women and Power, a manifesto by Dame Mary Beard, an English classicist. This is a collection of 2 lectures she gave in 2014 and 2017, the public voice of women and women in power, respectively. In these, she emphasizes how cultural responses to women's public speaking today are still influenced by ancient Greco-Roman traditions, in which public speaking was not only exclusively for men, but a defining characteristic of masculinity. Women could traditionally speak out only 1, to testify as to their victimhood when a crime had been committed against them, or 2, to support issues concerning women, and only women, as a community. And even though women in theory are legally equal, these are still largely true. How often do we see female politicians supporting women-specific issues because who else would push them otherwise? It also doesn't take much to notice the difference in response to women's public speech versus men's. Women's speaking is often dehumanized, compared to animal noises, or described as whining or whinging. Responsive comments devolve into threats of violence so much more casually. And women who are in positions of power with a public voice have to embody men to do so, wearing trouser suits or learning to lower the pitch of their voice as Margaret Thatcher was trained. We've still got a long way to go. In her second lecture, she coincidentally discusses Charlotte Perkins Gilman, in particular a novel she wrote, which I'll get to shortly. Number 29 was a souvenir I picked up from a day in Bristol when I had to get my biometrics taken for my British citizenship application. My friend and I stumbled upon John Wesley's New Room, which purports to be the oldest Methodist building in the world, founded in 1739. There were a few writings by Wesley in the gift shop, and I liked the title of this one, A Letter to a Friend Concerning Tea. For some reason, I assumed this would be a charming English correspondence about the delights of drinking tea, but it was quite the opposite. Wesley instead suggests that everyone would be physically better off, based on his own anecdotal experience, if they stopped drinking tea altogether. He then discusses a number of hypothetical objections to tea abstinence, and reasons his way through all of them, in fairness, in a very polite and everyone must make their own decisions manner. The main point is that it should make you feel better, but even if it doesn't, refraining from tea will save you some money, and that will assist the most destitute, both directly and indirectly, by freeing up excess cash for others who then, to be good Christians, should donate it to the poor. Number 30 is Herland. This is the novel by Charlotte Perkins Gilman that was mentioned in Mary Beard's Women in Power. And since I liked the yellow wallpaper so much, I decided to read it. It is a novel about three men who fancy themselves explorers and set out to discover this legendary female-only country, which has been thriving for thousands of years and reproducing by parthenogenicists. What they find is basically the most perfect community to ever exist, a feminist utopia where everything is both practical and beautiful. There are even count them, two passages discussing the sheer quantity and expert craftsmanship of pockets in their garments. But what is incredibly interesting about Gilman's writing is how she explores the male characters with regard to their attitude towards women. The narrator, Van Dyke Jennings, is very open-minded and scientific about the whole experience, fascinated by everything he learns, giving the women his highest respect, and really dissecting all his preconceptions about the superiority of a male-dominated world. Meanwhile, one companion, Jeff Margrave, is quite romantic and idealistic in his view towards women, wanting to worship, protect, and serve women, while the other, Terry O. Nicholson, is the embodiment of toxic masculinity. Terry is the man's man, who in his casual misogyny feels that there are only two types of women, those who are desirable and those who are undesirable. Terry had to learn a good many things he did not want to. Meanwhile, the women of Herland are fascinated by their male visitors and gently and comfortably imprison them for months so as to learn from them and teach the men their respective languages and histories. It is through these discussions of varying practices that Gilman also puts into question many social issues that to me seemed quite progressive for 1915. From animal rights and sustainability, to childcare and population control, to American exceptionalism, discussions of religion, the morality of marital SA, to the concept of femininity itself. They were inconveniently reasonable, these women. This is one of those novels that doesn't really have much of a plot and could easily have been a non-fiction study on philosophy and social change, but by turning it into a fictional utopian story, it softens the discussion and lowers your defenses to really listen to and question these ideas, to see things from the perspective of a very likable set of characters. This was a very pleasant surprise in my reading this year, I must say. Also, I adore these editions by Renard Press, not only because they are stunningly designed, based on an early edition of the yellow wallpaper, but they also contain some very helpful notes at the back. And this publisher is one of the first UK climate-positive publishers focused on sustainability at their core. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, I think, would have been very proud. Numbers 31 through 43 were Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events, some of which I've currently lent to a friend of mine. I'm not going to hold all these up. This is ridiculous. That'll do. I believe I read the first 6 books way back in middle school, but I never finished the series. So here I am some 20 plus years later, finally getting through the complete set to the end. The one thing I remembered the most about these books, and still one of the things I enjoy the most, is how the author weaves contextual vocabulary lessons into the books. As someone who spends a lot of time looking up words I don't recognize when I read, now organized into my own personal dictionary on my Remarkable Pro, I love that these books encourage that sort of learning from a young age. But in addition, reading these books again as an adult, I'm also noticing the life lessons woven amongst the ridiculousness of the adult characters. Things like how even well-intentioned people may let you down, how anything in extremes can be problematic, from extreme fixations on safety or what's in, or being adverse to arguments, from the hostile hospital. They were beginning to see that the crowd would believe just about anything if they thought it was being said by a medical professional. Daniel Handler, the actual name of the author behind Snickett's pen, wrote some fantastic child characters that are role models to children who love to imagine, invent, and learn. That said, reading them as an adult, the format did start to lag after a while, and the ending felt incomplete. Things like the importance of the sugar bowl and the cause of the schism are never fully explained, which is fine. The Quagmire triplets keep getting mentioned after they leave the story, but there's never a resolution to let us readers know if they're even still alive. Don't get me wrong, things being left as mysteries or open questions are perfectly allowed, but I didn't get the sense that they were crafted to be that way intentionally. They just weren't addressed. I'd looked them up to see if I'd missed something, but no. The Netflix series, which I had seen years ago but mostly forgot, gave us some explanations, but not the books. Especially for a children's series, it felt to me like a contract had been broken between author and reader. I then also read the Lemony Snicket Unauthorized Autobiography, number 44, hoping there might be a little extra explanation there. But I love a good companion book, but this was pointless. It's good only if you want a bit more of the Snicket writing style. It adds nothing to the story and only leaves you with even more unanswered questions. Whilst I was reading Lemony Snicket, I also listened to a couple of non-fiction audiobooks. Number 45 is one that was recommended by a legal YouTuber I sometimes follow named Andrea Burkhart. It's called Duped: Why Innocent People Confess and Why We Believe Their Confessions by Saul Kassin. I had already seen the first season of Netflix's docuseries The Confession Tapes, which is also mentioned in the book, so I had a little knowledge already about false confessions, but this really expanded that interest for me. I am always intrigued by studies into human psychology, especially when it disabuses what we might perceive as common sense. In this case, the idea that no innocent person would ever confess to a crime they didn't commit. This is mainly focused on interrogation techniques used by American police, particularly the decades-long used Reid technique. Essentially, there are three categories of false confessions, but all of them are generally the result of hours upon hours of breaking down an individual's psychological state, isolating them, and driving them to a point of exhaustion and/or a complete deconstruction of their sense of reality. And usually, juries are blithely unaware of any of these processes because they're standard practice, and only see the final, highly rehearsed so-called free confession. Luckily, many countries have adopted much healthier and more effective interview techniques based on advancements in psychological and criminal research, namely the peace technique, first developed here in England and Wales, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I can recommend this to anyone interested in criminal law and/or psychology, but if you're not interested enough to invest the time in reading the book, there were plenty of docu-series and dramatized series on or including the topic of false confessions mentioned in the book, which I concurrently watched or rewatched whilst reading this, that are equally excellent and worth a watch, as I feel it's important to know how these things can happen to anyone, no matter how much you may think you would never admit to something you didn't do. I've already mentioned the confession tapes, but I also watched Making a Murderer, as well as both a docu-series and dramatized series titled When They See Us, about the Central Park Five, now known as the Exonerated Five. There are some others recommended in the book which I haven't yet watched, but before I leave this book, the main takeaway from what I want to get out there is: don't ever talk to the police without a lawyer, even, if not especially, if you're innocent. Number 46 is the other audiobook, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. This is a history of astounding medical advancements weaved through the biography of an African-American woman in the segregated American South, who was unwittingly the source of said advancements, especially in the safe testing of the polio vaccine, cancer research, and genetic understanding. Henrietta Lacks died of cervical cancer in 1951. But during her treatment, samples of her cervical cells were taken without her knowledge or permission amidst a larger effort to create immortal cells, cells that could reproduce indefinitely to be used for medical research. Lacks's cells, which came to be known as HeLa cells, happened to be the winning cells, reproducing prolifically. And when she ultimately succumbed to the cancer, her family was pressured into permitting an autopsy, during which more cell samples were taken from all over her body. But very few really cared to know much about the woman all these miraculous cells came from, until this science reporter, Rebecca Skloot, set out to write this book about her. It turns out that a lot of money was made on Henrietta's cells, as they were sold to all different areas of research, including space exploration, cosmetics and pharmaceuticals, and even atomic bomb testing. And yet, the family she left behind, who couldn't even afford healthcare, were never told, nor ever received a dime. Skloot doesn't just stop with Henrietta's life either. She also reports on her family and community after her death. It's a story that covers so many different topics, from science and history to research ethics to racial disparity, both in the Jim Crow era and beyond. As is fairly typical for myself, I hit a reading slump during the summer months where my reading slowed right down. Seeing as I was working toward this goal, I knew I had to catch up with some shorter books. Call it cheating, but again, it's my arbitrary goal, so I get to follow my arbitrary rules. And my arbitrary rules include anything that is published somewhere by itself as a book. So some of these I read out of larger collections, but were originally published in their shorter forms. Others, like some short stories, have been published later, like in these mini penguin books. Starting with some poetry collections for numbers 47 through 51. The first collections I started reading were by T.S. Eliot, Prufrock and Other Observations, Poems 1920, and The Wasteland. These actually came out of reading a series of unfortunate events, where The Wasteland is referenced in the 11th book, The Grim Grotto, along with Lewis Carroll's The Walrus and the Carpenter. I was already familiar with much of Lewis Carroll's work, but not so much with T.S. Eliot, at least not his poetry. I had read Murder in the Cathedral a few years ago. Luckily, I had this classic Penguin collection of selected poems, which contained these 3 collections and more. I've discovered I really love some of Eliot's work. I loved Prufrock right away. The Wasteland took a long time to get through. As Klaus Baudelaire remarked, it is very opaque. But I really took the time to understand it properly by loading it onto my Remarkable Pro and taking copious annotations, then going back through to read after taking the time to understand it all broken down. I bought this at the end of 2024, by the way, and it's one of my absolute favorite tools. This is not an ad. Maybe I'll talk about it more another time. This is already a long enough video. The next books of poetry I read were by Jen Campbell, an author and poet of many styles and genres whom I love, and who has her own YouTube channel if you want to check her out. Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit is her most recent collection, published in 2023, and truly a personal and exposing one. As a disabled person born with ectrodactyly ectodermal dysplasia clefting syndrome, the sort of disability the lobster men at Victorian freak shows possessed, for her very likely as a result of radioactive rain that fell on northern England following the Chernobyl disaster, this collection drops you into her mindset growing up passing through surgery after surgery in hospital after hospital, finding escapes from her color-changing house of a body, surviving callous doctors, and struggling through IVF. I know she has now successfully had a child, which brings light at the end of a very emotionally exhausting but brilliantly poignant collection. It is perhaps my favorite work of hers that I've yet read. The other collection was The Hungry Ghost Festival, her debut poetry collection from 11 years prior. Some of the same integral themes of her life obviously make an appearance here as well, but this is a more nostalgic collection reflecting on her childhood and adolescence in the northeast of England. I also audiobooked a few of H.G. Wells's stories. First, number 52 was The Time Machine, read by actor Hugh Bonneville. Strangely enough, I don't think I've ever properly read any of Wells's work, but I've been aware of his stories through other media. With The Time Machine, I could directly connect it to a film I've watched many, many times called Time After Time, which was clearly inspired by this story, in which an unnamed protagonist, simply called the Time Traveler, starts by showing off his new time machine invention to a group of friends one evening. He then decides to travel to the year 802,701 and returns 8 days later his time to tell them about his experience. In the film Time After Time, a characterization of H.G. Wells himself starts out in much the same way, also showing off his newly built time machine. But instead of taking off for the very distant future, his friend, who turns out to secretly be Jack the Ripper, steals the time machine first, causing Wells to have to chase after him into 1970s San Francisco. It's a fantastic film with a great cast. Both, however, expose an initial hope for the discovery of some futuristic utopia, only to be let down by a negative progression of modern humanity. In the story, there has literally evolved two races descended from humans. One from the haves, the Eloi, who live a life of ease above ground in luxury and safety, but have become small, weak, and unintelligent, and the other, the Morlocks, from the have-nots, who toil away in the darkness underground to provide everything for the Eloi. It is a substantial commentary by Wells on classism. It was also very interesting reading this after having read Herland, being a similar sort of tale in format. Number 53 was Wells's The Invisible Man, which is on 2 of my life goal reading lists. It's among the first 1,000 Penguin books, and it is on my books read by Matilda list. It is, of course, a short story about, well, an invisible man. A scientist, actually, whose experiment goes awry when he finds himself unable to reverse his optical achievement. So he wraps himself in bandages, clothing, and accessories, and hunkers down in an inn in a little English village with his bottles and equipment, trying to find a cure. Meanwhile, the villagers grow ever more suspicious of the stranger. What I found, reading both this and The Time Machine back to back, is how Wells really hits on how vulnerable humans are to fear when faced with the different, and how easily that fear can turn into violent instincts, no matter how advanced or intelligent a person may find themselves. The time traveler has an instinctive fear of the Morlocks, and later on the giant crab-like creatures living near the end of the world, despite alluding to his intellectual superiority. Here, in The Invisible Man, when the villagers are finally faced with the stranger's nothingness, they flee in fearful pandemonium. Over 100 years on, we like to think we are even more advanced, more rational, but are we really? It's perfectly fine, of course, that we still have evolutionary survival instincts that are so reactive to fear, but once we learn why that is, and realize that the fear isn't necessarily justified, we have a responsibility to be better. Number 54 is another short story, Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum. My brother-in-law asked for some Poe for Christmas, so I got him a vintage Tales of Mystery and Imagination. Not this one. Anyway, I found myself waiting for an appointment without my book at the time, but I had my brother-in-law's gift still in my bag, so I flipped through and realized I'd never read this one. My goodness, was Poe a genius of his dark craft. His use of language to psychologically disturb, but in such a beautifully haunting way. I really must visit his grave. If you haven't seen in some of my other videos, I also collect, in a way, visiting graves as part of my life goals list. Anyway, The Pit and the Pendulum is a short story about a prisoner of the Spanish Inquisition being trapped in a dungeon, and it is written from his perspective as he tries to cope with his situation psychologically and not descend into utter despair and insanity whilst being threatened first with a pit in the center of the cell as he gropes around in the pitch black, and then, after waking up to find he's strapped down to a wooden board, a blade swinging on a pendulum above his heart, very gradually getting lower and lower. If you want spooky psychological thrill and horror, well, if you want a bit of Poe, give it a try. Number 55 was another audiobook, The Queen and I by Sue Townsend. I picked this up because it was recommended by James O'Brien at some point last year, and it sounded intriguing, but I ended up reading it as an audiobook narrated excellently by Angela Thorne. It is a satirical novel about a Republican Party winning the UK general election and immediately abolishing the monarchy, leaving the royal family to live as commoners in council houses. They are allowed to bring palace possessions with them, but they cannot sell any of them and are forced to live on state pensions instead. And by law, no one is allowed to bow or curtsy to them or give them any special attention. It's a little awkward reading, being published in 1992, clearly written before Charles and Diana's divorce, let alone Diana's death, but Townsend's take on how each royal might react to the realities of struggling in a life on welfare, including even the royal dogs, is witty and believable. That said, I have to say, I was immensely disappointed in the ending. I don't want to spoil the ending for anyone who wants to read it, but I kind of have to in order to explain why I didn't like it. So this is your cue to skip ahead if you don't want to hear it. 3, 2, 1. So, it was a dream all along. Well, a nightmare. The Queen's nightmare. A cop-out ending in itself. Really, the main reason I disliked it was because it doesn't make sense to me that the Queen should have such a realistic, detailed and emotional dream of what that sort of life is like when she's had precisely zero experience of such matters in real life. Not to mention, of course, that any sort of different way of governing has to automatically fail in a catastrophic sort of fashion within her nightmare, of course. So, moving on. Number 56 was the Gothic horror novel The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux, which obviously inspired the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. I've been a very long time fan of the musical and know it very well. In fact, it was my first Broadway show when I was 15, visiting New York City with my parents. But I'd always wanted to read the original novel to acquire more layers of the story, so I decided to audiobook this one. It actually surprised me how close the musical is to the novel, up until the climax and end sequence, which had many differences. Otherwise, the musical mostly just parsed down and combined characters. Madame Giry, for instance, has a different relationship to the Phantom in the novel, merely doing his bidding because he has promised to make her daughter Megan Empress, somehow. Whereas the musical's backstory is that she knew Eric the Phantom from when they were young and rescued him from a freak show, helping him to build a safe haven underneath the opera house. This latter aspect of her character seems to have actually been drawn from a character in the novel known as the Persian, a mysterious figure who doesn't enter the story much until the end, but then fully takes part in the final showdown, and explains Eric's entire backstory in the epilogue. Quite a lot of the focus in the book, however, is on Raoul, which is a shame because I found him a bit overdramatic in the novel. If you can do nothing for Christine, at least let me die for her. Most of the climax, in fact, is focused on Raoul and the Persian trying to find Christine and escape from the dangers of Eric's traps. Meanwhile, almost everything between Eric and Christine happens off-screen and is only relayed after the fact. I must admit, I think the musical is really the better format for this story. The ending sequence of the musical especially felt much more emotional, plus a story so wrapped in music hits differently when you don't actually have the music. A lot of the key moments of the musical that, of course, are accentuated by the songs simply whiz by you in the book. But it is the story's original form, published back in 1909 to 1910, and the epilogue is actually worth reading if you want to learn how Eric became everything he was. Number 57 was a children's picture book my colleague lent me. The Talipo, a ghost story by Joanna Galdone and illustrated by Paul Galdone. She was telling me how it used to traumatize her children, and now I'm traumatized as well! If you were traumatized by a childhood book, let me know in the comments. I then needed a pick-me-up from the joys of the world, so I listened to the two Philomena Kunk audiobooks. Kunk on Everything and The World According to Kunk. If you've never seen the extremely British history-adjacent comedy shows, Kunk on Britain, Kunk on Earth, Kunk on Life, etc., check those out first. Diane Morgan plays this character, Philomena Kunk, who is a dim-witted but completely deadpanned host trying to present serious history programs. Her interviews with genuine experts in their respective fields are the highlights of every one of them, each interviewee trying to answer her inane questions as politely as possible.
Which was more culturally significant, the Renaissance or Single Ladies by Beyoncé?
They both had their period.
Why are pyramids that shape? Is it to stop homeless people sleeping on them?
I don't think they had many homeless people in ancient Egypt.
Whenever you see medieval times, there's this sort of annoying hey nonny no music playing constantly.
Yeah, pretty much.
That music, that sort of...
Yeah.
Where's that sound coming from? Couldn't they switch it off?
The books or audiobooks are then great if you simply want more Kunk in your life. Although I will point out that Kunk on Everything came out in 2018, around the time of Kunk on Britain, before the later programs blew up internationally. So it's a little more culturally focused on the UK, and many of the better punchlines in this book were reused for Kunk on Earth and or Kunk on Life. It is in an encyclopedic format with subjects in alphabetical order. The World According to Kunk is written in a historic timeline order and came out in 2024, so it is not only more updated, but it also has a slightly broader focus, although still mainly focused on the UK and the US. I preferred this one overall. Like other good comedy that sometimes touches on the political, it has excellent moments of satire mixed in with the purely funny jokes and occasional rudeness. Number 60 was The Lady in the Van, which I always thought for some reason was a fictional short story. In fact, it is a memoir created from a curated collection of diary entries of playwright Alan Bennett, telling the mostly true story of his interactions with Miss Mary Shepherd, an enigmatic elderly woman who plonked her dilapidated van first in front of and subsequently on his driveway in North London for 15 years. What a fantastic look into human eccentricities, not just with Miss Shepherd herself, but in the responses of those around her. A film was made in 2015 starring Maggie Smith, which I checked out after reading this, and it is a fantastic adaptation, with many lines verbatim from the book, but some extra dramatized elements. Number 61 was a gothic short story called The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffmann. The narrator recalls a young man named Nathaniel who was raised on childhood stories of a boogeyman character known as the Sandman, who is said to steal the eyes of children who would not go to bed and feed them to his own children who lived in the moon. He comes to associate this character with people and traumatic occurrences that he encounters and sends him into madness. It was fun. I read it in October along with some other fantastic spooky tales. Number 62 is another audiobook, one I actually listened to partly last year and sort of dropped off but then picked back up again. I almost never read biographies or memoirs, especially not of celebrities, so when I do it, it is strictly via audiobook, with the authors themselves narrating, because I simply enjoy listening to their voice. In this case, I listened to the absolutely lovely Miriam Margolyes reading her first memoir, This Much Is True. I first took note of her as Professor Sprout in Harry Potter and in her roles in Blackadder, although I realized in listening to this that I would have seen and heard her in many, many other roles without realizing. But I'll be frank, I came for the outrageous anecdote she told on Graham Norton and the like, but I stayed for the rich and varied experience Miriam had to relay, with deeply nuanced and well-articulated viewpoints I could admire. She just makes me smile, makes me laugh, makes me want to have a conversation and get to know her. And boy does she have some incredible stories to tell. Her openness and vulgarity can put some off, but it doesn't me at all. Two quotes I wrote down from her memoir were, "That's the magic word, pretending. It's the beginning of imagination." And, "When people say to me, 'Oh, I never talk about money, religion, or politics,' I say, 'What the do you talk about then? Those are the things that matter!'" And indeed, she does talk about each of those in her book, alongside her acting reminiscences. The final chapters of the book, in my opinion, are the best part for this reason. She is exactly the sort of critical thinker I aspire to be, acknowledging complexities and seeming contradictions of life and politics and people in a world which seems to constantly want to put things in the most black and white terms. She has chosen her side, and it is the side of humanity, truth, and righting wrongs whenever she sees them. Margolyes' memoir then led me onto her one-woman play she co-wrote with Sonia Fraser, titled Dickens' Women, number 63, which tells all about the real women in Charles Dickens' life that inspired some of his female characters, with excerpts of said characters then performed. The audiobook of this is in fact a recording from one of her brilliant performances, which I really wish I'd seen. I'll definitely be revisiting this as I read more of Dickens' works. Number 64 is another audiobook, The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. I am familiar with Green as a novelist, having read a couple of his young adult novels, The Fault in Our Stars being one of my absolute favorites, and watching his Vlogbrothers content now and again on YouTube along with his brother Hank Green. Genuinely two of my favorite humans on Earth, doing so much good for the world with their success. This book was downright lovely, and Green's narration felt like a warm blanket on the calm autumnal days during which I was listening to it. It is a series of essays on topics ranging from Diet Dr. Pepper and Canada geese to Halley's Comet, plague, and the human capacity for wonder. Each one reviewed completely subjectively according to his own life experiences and somewhat ironically star-rated. The essays were written over several years, but many center around the COVID-19 pandemic. As he puts it, the book fathoms, quote, some of the contradictions of human life as he experiences it, how we can be so compassionate and so cruel, so persistent and so quick to despair. The chapters on Monopoly and Mario Kart being key examples. And above all, the contradiction of human power, at once far too powerful and not nearly powerful enough. Surprisingly, the chapters on the world's largest ball of paint and on Poa Pratensis or Kentucky Bluegrass were two of my favorites, even though they sound utterly undramatic. This whole collection is a drinking a mug of hot cocoa, lying back and looking at the stars whilst bundled up in cozy blankets, watching your breath fog against the cold wind, and noticing how your teeth are chattering and your heart is racing with anxiety. But isn't that what's making you feel alive? Sort of feeling. In book form. Number 65 is a short story collection by Bram Stoker published in Penguin Books' new archive series titled The Burial of the Rats. I picked it up at my local bookstore in anticipation of spooky season, and it didn't disappoint. Now, I have to confess, I did not enjoy Dracula, Stoker's most famous work. For being such a classic, I found it a really boring read. And the same for the 1931 film starring Bela Lugosi. I much prefer the other classic monster thrillers, both in literature and on film. That said, I really enjoyed this collection of Stoker's, particularly the first two stories. The first story is actually what is believed to be an excised opening of Dracula, entitled Dracula's Guest, and for me it was so much better than the entire novel was. I even picked Dracula back up to see if maybe I was misremembering and read the first few pages. I wasn't. If Dracula had kept this story as its opening, I think it would have been much better. The second story I really liked is called The Judge's House, about a mathematical student who rents an old abandoned house in a quiet village to study and finds himself constantly inundated with the sound of rats scurrying and squeaking through the walls, except once a day when they instantly stop and leave him in a sudden, unnerving silence. The other three stories included were good, although I found one of them ruined by the last sentence, but these first two were my favorites. Number 66 is The Death of Francis Bacon by Max Porter. This is an art exhibition of paintings using the medium of words, imagining the final days of the 20th century painter Francis Bacon. Porter is a very experimental writer whom I'm certain I don't completely understand, but I always enjoy. I'm not convinced his writing is meant to be understood as such, but rather felt. And while I didn't like this as much as Lanny or Grief is the Thing with Feathers, I thought this best illustrated that notion in his explicit connection with art. When you look at a painting in a gallery, it is there to be experienced and interpreted according to each individual observer. There isn't one universal correct understanding. That's how The Death of Francis Bacon felt. Number 67 is a collection of poetry by Edward Thomas titled There Was a Time. Thomas is known as one of the English World War I poets, the first one I've read, although little of his poetry was about the war itself. He only began writing at 36 and was killed in action in 1917 at the age of 39. But his poetry is incredibly rich with the nature and rural nostalgia of early 20th century Britain. Reading some of these, you can clearly picture him looking across a quiet battlefield, yearning for the life to which he would never return, and it's incredibly haunting and melancholically beautiful. Number 68 is Nobody's Girl by Virginia Roberts Giuffre. I began listening to the audiobook the day it came out, which is unusual for me. This is the memoir of the most outspoken victim of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's sex trafficking cabal, a world I can't possibly fathom. I had heard pieces of her story before from interviews, but this lays it all out, explaining the parts of her abusive childhood that put her in the vulnerable position to succumb to further abuse. What would it be like, she wonders, to matter? Her ultimate escape from Epstein and Maxwell, her attempts at healing and starting a family, and then her struggles through being involved with the legal cases and the press and the intimidation that came with it. However, the most harrowing and heartbreaking part of the book for me is what's not in it. The domestic abuse we now know she suffered from her husband for years, which ultimately led her to taking her own life just 6 months before her book would see publication. I couldn't help but cringe whenever she spoke of her husband as her savior, her soulmate, her protector. The end especially made my stomach drop because it feels so hopeful, despite her laying out the struggles she was having with her mental and physical health and prior attempts to end it all. She was staying alive for herself and for her family, with intentions for the future that would now never be. It makes me angry that a life dedicated to speaking out for victims and putting up with repeated attempts at being discredited was brought to an end because her claims were once again not believed. That instead, her husband's absurd claims that the extensive bruising to her face and the crack in her sternum was self-inflicted, to the extent that he succeeded in getting a restraining order against her, preventing her from seeing her kids, the people she loved most and for whom she lived. This was shortly after she suffered major injuries from a bus crash, by the way, and was still recovering from a broken neck and subsequent surgery, and was suffering from chronic pain with a diagnosis of fibromyalgia alongside a healthy dose of PTSD, according to some interviews with her brothers and ghostwriter I've seen since. When are we going to start believing victims? These stories need to be listened to, and that's why I listened. Now that her story is finally fully out, I guess we'll just see what happens next. Number 69 is an audiobook from this collection of classic Black narratives I already had in my Audible library from when I read 12 Years a Slave a few years ago, and it was absolutely incredible. The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man by James Weldon Johnson. This is a fictional account of a fair-skinned biracial man in post-Reconstructionist America, with incredibly complex and nuanced observations of Black culture and the classes within, race relations, particularly contrasting those parts of society where whites and Blacks actually coexist versus where they stay separate and resentful, and life around the turn of the 20th century on a spectrum from the completely broke and gambling addicted to the high life of accompanying a millionaire around Europe. The main character not only physically but culturally passes for white, having been raised very happily in the North with a loving mother, a good educational experience, and respect from the community as a piano prodigy. So his perspectives come across as very objective and neutral, curious and embracing, and at times critical, as he experiences both white and Black cultures. That is, of course, until he witnesses a particular event, forcing him to make a choice as to which culture he will choose to live in. This is a novel, but it honestly reads like nonfiction, especially in chapters 5 and 10, which dive into the race conversation the most, which I went back and reread because I found them so profoundly nuanced. This was published in 1912, at a time when, quote, special pleas have already been made for and against the Negro in hundreds of books, but in these books, either his virtues or his vices have been exaggerated. This is because writers, in nearly every instance, have treated the colored American as a whole. Each has taken some one group of the race to prove his case. Not before has a composite and proportionate presentation of the entire race, embracing all of its various groups and elements, showing the relations with each other and to the whites, been made. That was from the preface to the original edition, which, by the way, was published anonymously because discussing race in this way really hadn't been done yet in literature, and Johnson was worried as to the controversy it might stir up. But despite breaking literary ground, it also reads very timelessly. In many ways, it could have taken place at any point in the early part of the 20th century, right up through the 1960s in my eyes. And even so, some of the arguments are so universal that they still, in my mind, apply to today. not just for Black people, but for all minorities and the relationships with the majority. Number 70 is the third book I had pre-ordered this year from one of my absolute favorite children's authors, Anna James, author of the Pages & Co. series, among others, whom I had the fortune to meet at the Cheltenham Literature Festival a while back. This new book is called Alice with a Y, and it is a sequel to Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, in which Alice's granddaughter, another Alice, but spelt with a Y, follows her own adventure through Wonderland. Now, Alice is very, very close to my heart, being one of, if not my favorite childhood story, to the extent that I dressed up as Alice for many consecutive Halloweens. And I can honestly say that this book absolutely does Wonderland justice. It is everything I could have asked for in a sequel. It weaves in some of the original characters just enough without being too referential, and all of the new characters and locations within Wonderland completely fit. And the style of writing is sublime in its use of nonsense and endearingly irritating scenarios. For anyone who is an Alice fan, I can 100% recommend this, whether old or young. This copy is actually the Waterstones exclusive edition with gorgeous sprayed edges and signed marbled end papers. Now, I actually couldn't decide between this and another exclusive edition, which is this independent bookshop edition with equally gorgeous but entirely different sprayed edges. Plain end papers though. I think on balance I do prefer the Waterstones edition, so I may end up gifting the other, or I may keep them both. I haven't decided. After finishing Alice with a Y, I did have an impulse to return to the original story, but I did so in a way I'd not experienced before. Instead of the original published version, I read Alice's Adventures Underground. This is a facsimile of Lewis Carroll's original handwritten manuscript from 1864, which was then rewritten and expanded into Alice's Adventures in Wonderland the next year. But this is the original story he wrote and illustrated for Alice Little, the real girl who inspired the character, and it's really lovely, not only to literally experience the story in his own hand, but to get a slightly different version than the classic we're used to. Many little things here and there are slightly different from what they would later become. So that was number 71. Number 72 took me in a very different direction. A 19th century essay entitled On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts by Thomas de Quincey, which satirically takes the form of a lecture to a gentleman's club of homicide enthusiasts called the Society of Connoisseurs in Murder. The art is discussed from an aesthetic point of view, rating different famous murders throughout history and talking about the pros and cons of modern methods. For instance, "Fie on these dealers in poison, say I. Can they not keep to the old honest way of cutting throats, without introducing such abominable innovations from Italy? I consider all these poisoning cases, compared with the legitimate style, as no better than the waxwork by the side of the sculpture." This Penguin Little Classic edition is actually only the first essay in a trilogy of de Quincey's essays on this subject. I've now seen that there appears to be an Oxford World's Classics edition that contains all three, but I don't think at this point I'm going to read the other two. Personally, I think I enjoyed the satirical premise a little more than the actual writing style, but it was very much in the same vein as, and in fact references, my next read. A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift was number 73, another satirical essay which, written in 1729, preceded de Quincey by a century. If you aren't already aware of this famous essay, let me first read the full title. A modest proposal for preventing the children of poor people in Ireland from being a burden to their parents or country, and for making them beneficial to the public. The way Swift suggests relieving the poor of Ireland from their burdensome children and benefiting the public? Eating babies. Rearing the children of the poor, particularly those born out of wedlock who are at risk of being aborted, and especially those of Catholic families, to the plump age of 1 year old, and then selling them off to be juicily prepared for the dinner tables and parties of the elite. The mothers can make a decent living as breeders, fewer children become thieves and unproductive drains on society, businesses will thrive, and more people will be provided delicious and nourishing meals. Make Ireland great again, eh? Swift's extreme satirical hyperbole was aimed at the hostile and dehumanizing attitudes toward the poor, as well as the anti-Catholic sentiments and English rule over Ireland at the time. I enjoyed reading this much more than On Murder, which isn't really surprising as this is still considered to this day to be one of the best English examples of ironic literature. Number 74 is A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. This was not a book for me, and that's okay. It was recommended to me by a friend. I had to restart it once or twice. I tried audiobooking it. I did get all the way through it, but I found it very hard to focus or care. I just find upper middle class Edwardian English society and romance and chat about gossip and manners incredibly boring. Even though I love Edwardian aesthetics, and even though parts of this take place in Italy, which I adore and have spent time in, the story just wasn't for me. I want to say I'm too old for this story to have really hit home, but I do like coming-of-age stories in other contexts, and I certainly enjoy a good romance. But even the romantic scenes were so brief or skipped over entirely that I was almost missing them happening altogether. I don't know. I had intended to one day read A Passage to India, which is also by Forster, but we'll see. Number 75 was a quick read, Storm by Tim Minchin. I am a huge admirer of Tim Minchin, both for his creative works and for his worldview. This is a graphicized version of his beloved anti-pseudoscience beat poem, Storm, illustrated by the folks who created the animated movie version, which currently has like 5.6 million views on YouTube. It also has some additional text from Tim and the illustrators discussing the origin and creation of Storm, as well as a foreword by Neil Gaiman, which sadly isn't quite as exciting as it once was. Nevertheless, I will never get tired of this poem in whatever format I can consume it. Number 76 is another audiobook, Nailed, 10 Christian Myths That Showed Jesus Never Existed at All, by David Fitzgerald. This will shock some people, but there is a community of people who believe that Jesus never in fact existed at all and is a pure myth along the lines of King Arthur. The reason most people tend to accept Jesus' existence as an irrefutable fact is because most biblical scholars agree on that. However, most biblical scholars are themselves Christian, so it is only recently that supposed fact has really been questioned in an in-depth scholarly manner. This book is a succinct and straightforward introduction to the mythicist arguments, breaking down 10 oft-repeated arguments from Christian apologists. Personally, I don't think it's an extraordinary claim to say that a person did physically, literally exist who was the basis for everything we call Jesus in religious and literary terms. But equally, I can see how even if a real person did exist, the entire religion of Christianity could have been developed in a mythicized format around him. And even that could have happened without the need for an actual person. A belief could be sufficient. I am by no means a biblical scholar or ancient historian, but religious history is something I've had an interest in for well over a decade. As far as Jesus' historicity, I'm not absolutely convinced either way, but I think this book does put the best mythicist arguments forward, which are certainly thought-provoking. The points that most intrigued me were the general connections to other pre-existing myths and religions, as well as the etymology of many biblical names, including Jesus itself and many of the 12 disciples, which seems to suggest that the names were crafted to fulfill the purpose of the narratives those characters tell, rather than being purely coincidental. In fact, this book also argues that the 12 apostles never existed either. The Gospel of Mark, it argues, the main foundation of the Jesus story, was simply a parable, stealing from other ancient myths and stories. If this sounds like an intriguing rabbit hole, this is a great place to start before diving into the full Richard Carrier and Robert Price of it all. A note on the audiobook recording, the narrator was generally fine, but the sound quality was slightly amateur in that you can hear some breath and mouth noises that are normally removed in higher quality audiobook recordings. I didn't find it too distracting personally, especially when listening in my car, but listening through my Bose headphones it stuck out a bit more. I did find speeding it up to 1.1 or 1.2 speed helped smooth it out. Number 77 was Orbital by Samantha Harvey, which won the Booker Prize in 2024. I loved this book's calm, contemplative, existential vibe. It painted with words a picture of what life would be like inside the International Space Station in so many ways I'd simply never thought about, orbiting the Earth 16 times a day, days and nights alternating every 90 minutes as they looked upon the Earth, the discomforts and annoyances of zero-gravity living, but the ecstasy of life nonetheless. The book doesn't really have a plot. It is, as the author describes in the afterword of this exclusive edition, more of a pastoral set in space. For a non-religious realist like me, the notion that we are so unimportant in this vast universe is actually a beautiful one, because how lucky are we to be given this opportunity to exist, full stop? And that's exactly what comes across in this book. And if you've never before heard the analogy of the cosmic calendar, aligning a timeline of the universe to a 365-day Earth year and seeing where everything lines up, the Orbit 13 chapter of this book explains it beautifully. Number 78 is Aesop's Fables. They're such an important foundation to literature and society. I was of course familiar with a few of them previously, but I never properly read through all of them. I can't say I necessarily agree with all of the messages they convey. I think many of them are outdated or require more nuance in a modern age, and I generally hate how much animal suffering is involved, but some are still viable. My favorites were The Lion and the Mouse and The Goat Herd and the Wild Goats. Number 79 is Love Poems by Christina Rossetti. I'd never read any of her work before, and this was a book discarded from our bookshop, so I took it home and read it. It's a compilation by Pavilion Books, but I think too much of the same theme in one collection made it feel quite repetitive. I did like a handful of them, but I'm interested to read something else by her in its original format, one of her original collections, or perhaps her fairy tale Goblin Market. If you have any suggestions, throw them my way. Number 80 is another audiobook that I spontaneously decided to read. You Want to Be on Top? A memoir of makeovers, manipulation, and not becoming America's Next Top Model by Sarah Hartshorn. Because, full disclosure, Top Model is a nostalgic guilty pleasure I just can't shake. I grew up with the show, I've rewatched every cycle except the last two multiple times, could probably still name most if not all of the girls in at least the first 18 cycles. I've even watched and rewatched several cycles of Britain's and Ireland's Next Top Model, as well as a few other modeling competition shows. And I'm not even interested in the fashion industry or modeling. I mean, I like the creative aspect of it, which is why I've watched some other reality competitions of a similar ilk. I honestly always hated the drama, which is why I am generally not even a person who watches much reality television, besides Top Model. Oh, and Project Runway. But for whatever goddamn reason, there is something about Top Model that keeps drawing me in. I'm slightly embarrassed to admit that Audition for America's Next Top Model even features on the early pages of my life goals list. Just to experience the audition, I might point out, not that I actually wanted to be on the show. Reading this, it is clear I would have been miserable. But when COVID hit and all of these interviews with the contestants started popping up on YouTube with Mr. and Miss J and Oliver Twixt and Jessica Cabesi, you bet I listened to every single one of them. So when my YouTube algorithm brought up an interview between Jessica Cabesi and Cycle 9's Sarah Hartshorn, the plus-sized contestant who got kicked off for not being plus-sized enough, even though come to find out she had the exact same measurements as the following cycle's plus-sized winner Whitney, and I found out she wrote a tell-all book about her experience, I immediately bought the audiobook. Do I have a problem? Perhaps. Probably. Did I enjoy all the tea spilled in this book? Absolutely. Despite all this, I do want to point out that Tyra Banks and Top Model did in fact do something really good for me personally, which was to broaden my idea of beauty as I watched cycle after cycle of girls, some of whom I could see myself in, but many of whom did not look anything like me. And yet, my instinctive notion of what was beautiful did shift, which was one of her missions in creating the show. But goddamn, they treated those girls as subhuman. And as this author points out, ANTM was undeniably a cult. Which immediately led me on to my next audiobook, number 81, Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. This was mentioned in You Want to Be on Top and also recommended to me by my sister. It is an exploration of cults and cult-like groups in America specifically, from the typical subjects of Jim Jones's People's Temple, Heaven's Gate, and Scientology, to modern secular versions like multi-level marketing businesses and fitness programs. The main focus of the book, however, is language, the patterns and vocabularies developed and used to lure people into converting and conforming, and then hook them into never leaving. According to Montell, the term brainwashing is an outdated concept, a metaphor. Any person in the right setting with the right wants and needs, given the right language, can become a member of a cult. And that is both scary and enlightening. And besides, using terms like brainwashed and cult are entirely ineffective anyway in having conversations. After all, those inside and those outside a cult will fully believe the other person is the brainwashed one. This book also points out that not all cults are bad, providing warning signs in a frank and empathetic way. I think this quote from Michael Shermer referenced in the book is also key. It's not that smart people aren't capable of believing in cultish things. Instead, it's that smart people are better at defending beliefs they arrived at for non-smart reasons. And that is exactly why I read and listen to lots of different perspectives, so I can challenge my own beliefs and ensure that I do have valid and sound reasons for them. It is exhausting, I'm not gonna lie, but unfortunately necessary. And this book did influence some nuanced shifts in my worldview. Numbers 82 through 86 were plays, most of which I read on the plane to and from Marrakesh, Morocco, where my husband and I visited for a long weekend for a little winter escape. The trip was incredible, by the way. Anyway, I read Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett and Our Town by Thornton Wilder, both of which were on the Well-Educated Mind reading list. Followed by When Wendy Grew Up, An Afterthought by J.M. Barrie, True West by Sam Shepard, and Night Mother by Marcia Norman, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Not technically on my life goals list yet, but I'm thinking of adding it. I think Night Mother was the most gripping of these 5 plays. A trigger warning for self-harm before I dive into the synopsis, so skip ahead if this is not for you. This play is essentially an hour-and-a-half conversation between a mother and daughter on the day that the daughter, Jessie, has decided she's going to end her life. She enters the kitchen living area more upbeat and talkative than she normally is, as described in the opening notes of the play, and nonchalantly discusses the plan for the day with her mother, explaining that when she's done with everything, when she's gone through everything her mother needs to know, when they've completed their regular routines, she's going to go through the doorway, staged ominously in the center of the room, lock the door behind her, and end her life using her dad's old pistol. The character study of these 2 women is extraordinary, and the focus on the fact that Jessie is feeling better than ever. As an epileptic, she hasn't had a seizure in a long time, and she has come to terms with her husband having left her, and that is exactly why she feels she has the clarity that she's ready to end it all, is powerful and perhaps counterintuitive to most. I think a lot of people who do take or attempt to take their own life do wait until they're feeling really good, because there's then a confidence in feeling that it's not going to get better than this. And there's a sense of control and agency that is so understandable. I found an interview on YouTube with Kathy Bates, the original Jessie, from 1984 when she was in the play, which I found very enlightening as well, and I recommend it as a supplement to reading or watching the play. There is a film version as well, which I've not yet seen, but Jessie is played by Sissy Spacek. I did enjoy all the other plays as well. Waiting for Godot is famously a French tragic comedy about 2 men sort of pondering life as they await someone named Godot who never arrives. It's very enigmatic and open to lots of different interpretations. Our Town is a 3-act play about life and death in a small town in America in the beginning of the 20th century. When Wendy Grew Up is an additional scene J.M. Barrie wrote to follow the story of Peter Pan, in which Peter returns to Wendy after she's long grown up and now has a daughter, whom Peter takes off to Neverland instead. This was added as a final chapter in the novel and is now commonly included in the telling of Peter Pan, but originally it was a separate piece altogether, and one day I intend to make a video all about the history of Peter Pan, so I read this and the foreword included as research for that. True West is a tale of 2 estranged American brothers who took their lives in very different directions. One who pursued education and became a Hollywood screenwriter with a family, and the other who lives a life of survival and burglary in the desert of California. The 2 are reunited to house sit for their mother, and a clash occurs when it seems they each start wanting the life the other has. Number 87 was another small item I brought with me on the Marrakesh trip because we returned on December 1st. A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas. Trying to get myself in the Christmas mood. Can't say it worked after having to say goodbye to sunny Marrakesh, but there we are. This is Thomas's short story about, well, exactly what it sounds like, childhood memories of a Christmas in Wales. This was recommended to me a few years ago from one of my YouTube viewers, so thank you. Number 88 was one I intended to read physically, but Ended up audiobooking because it was convenient, and the author did a brilliant self-narration. Once Upon a Tome, The Misadventures of a Rare Bookseller by Oliver Darkshire, which is a memoir of Darkshire's years as an apprentice bookseller at Henry Sutherland's historic rare bookshop in London. A bookseller myself, I thoroughly enjoyed this and commiserated with many anecdotes, although my bookshop is set up differently as an online-only shop. Naturally, I love these sorts of books, but even non-sellers would get a kick out of this brief glimpse into the eccentrically chaotic world of bookselling. I had previously read a similar memoir titled Diary of a Bookseller by Sean Bithell, which I do remember enjoying, but of the two, I would actually recommend this one more. It is absolutely hilarious and brilliantly written. Number 89 was another I had in my library for years intending to read and ended up audiobooking. Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers by Mary Roach, a journalistic exploration of what happens to our bodies after we die. I'm someone who has a practical worldview toward death, if not a slightly macabre interest in it. I don't fear death, although I do fear dying, and hope that when I go, it is quick and peaceful. I'm not sure I quite enjoyed this book as much as I thought I would. And if you are at all squeamish or uncomfortable with death, parts of this book are definitely not for you. Also, if you are an animal lover like me, this book will probably break your heart and absolutely enrage you. However, it does have some really useful information in it that I think normalizes death in a healthy way and talks about the real pros and cons of what to have done with your body after you die. My main takeaways are: 1, I am now more scared of being in a plane crash or automobile accident, but not to an extent that I think it will affect my decision making for travel in the future. And 2, no matter how horrifying the realities of it are, I would still 100% choose to be an organ donor, donate my body to science, and/or choose to be composted after I die so that my body can be useful when I'm done with it and be a net benefit to posterity rather than a burden. Number 90 was Dolly, a ghost story by Susan Hill. Despite it being December by this point, I really wanted to read a spooky story, and I so enjoyed The Woman in Black that when I saw this in my bookshop, I had to read it. I didn't enjoy it as much as The Woman in Black, though. I felt it was a little disjointed, and there are actually 2 dolls that feature in the story, both of which do the same spooky thing, but they are completely unconnected in their origin, so it's unclear what the source of the spookiness really is. The main girl is splendidly creepy. In my mind, I pictured her as a sort of Agnes DeMille from Wednesday. It was enjoyable, but not one of my favorites. I had a few weeks in December left with 10 books to go, so one Sunday I completely cleared my slate to have a little readathon, in which I read 3 children's books. The first, number 91, was an extraordinary children's book, The Invention of Hugo Cabret by Brian Selznick. This is the basis for the film Hugo, if you've seen that, which I did see a long time ago, but I didn't remember in detail. It is a very thick book, but it was a remarkably fast read. Only took me a few hours because it is filled with many illustrations, but it's not like any other illustrated book I've ever read, where either illustrations are usually there to supplement the story, or else it's a graphic novel where the illustrations are the main source of the story with a little text to clarify. This instead harmonizes both text and illustrations to tell the story. The story would be incomplete without one or the other. Let me show you what I mean. So in this scene, this is toward the end, and Hugo is about to be chased by a policeman. So you're reading, and then suddenly the entire chase scene happens through illustration. And it's just a phenomenal way of leading you through the story. And it goes on. But also there are references to some old silent films, and they include screenshots from those original films as well, which also just helps to really illustrate what it is the characters are looking at. So not only did I absolutely love the format of this book, not to mention the stunning design of it, but the story itself is also exquisite, even reinventing itself midway through. It also weaves in so much real history of so many areas of interest of mine, magic tricks and clockwork inventions and the dawn of film. I can't believe it took me so long to get around to reading this. I will definitely be revisiting this in the future and rewatching the film. Next, number 92, was The Story of Tracy Beaker by Jacqueline Wilson, which was on the BBC's Big Read list. This was a fantastic middle grade novel about a young girl who is stuck in a care home after 2 failed foster attempts. The story is told from her perspective, and I think it is a very honest and insightful way for kids who are perhaps in similar situations to feel less alone, to feel validated, and to maybe help cope with some of their trauma. I believe Tracy Beaker has become one of Jacqueline Wilson's best-known characters, with sequels and TV shows and all sorts following, none of which I grew up with, but I wish I had, because even as someone who didn't go through anything of this sort, I think reading this as a kid would have helped me to be a more empathetic person from an even earlier age. And the final book from this particular readathon, number 93, was Fantastic Mr. Fox by Roald Dahl. Just a Dahl book I hadn't read yet. Not a perfect story, so much of it is about animal cruelty, and yet the plight of these stolen chickens and turkeys is completely ignored, but I guess that's chalked up to nature and the normalcy of farming. The characterizations of the evil farmers are also very one-dimensional, with some problematic descriptions, but it's a kid's book of an older era, and that's to be expected in my eyes. I still think it's a nice story. Not everything has to perfectly withstand the test of time to be enjoyed. Number 94 was another Roald Dahl book, one that my very non-bookish husband has clear memories of reading. Boy, Tales of Childhood, one of his autobiographies. While schools may not be perfect nowadays, this book has certainly made me grateful for certain advancements, such as the abandonment of corporal punishment, and generally a bit more accountability for teachers who are high on power. That said, there were some lovely and hilarious anecdotes in here as well that give a very nostalgic feel. Makes me want to go back to Wales, and soon! Number 95 was another brand new book I read via audiobook. Eleanor, a 200-mile walk in search of England's lost queen by Alex Loxton. Some family members on my husband's side were audiobooking it and recommended it to me. This is the author's account of walking the funeral procession of Queen Eleanor of Castile, wife of King Edward I, from Lincoln to London, which originally occurred in 1290, and where later on 12 Eleanor crosses were erected, only 3 of which still survive today. Fun fact I learned from this book: if you look up simply London on Google Maps, the point it takes you to is Charing Cross, a famous junction referencing the original spot of the Charing Cross, one of the now lost Eleanor crosses. Considering how gloomy it was most of the time when I was listening to this made me crave even more going out for a nice spring walk through England and visiting all of the historic places, monuments, and cathedrals that has become one of my favorite pastimes. I have certainly added a few things onto my travel list from this book. But full credit to the author, she did not do this trek in the lovely spring weather, but in December, the same exact time of year in which I was reading it. She was, after all, trying to match Eleanor's exact journey, and she had had the audacity to die right at the end of November. This book very much felt like a documentary program you'd find on British television. A bit of walking and exploration, a bit of history, a cozy journey to take with a cup of tea. Quote, "When we are curious, the world becomes an exciting place, and a comforting one, too." Side note, Eleanor also led me to read John Betjeman's poem Diary of a Church Mouse as a little addition to this year's reading. Number 96 was A Christmas Morning Special, The Christmas Tree, a short story by Charles Dickens, in which the narrator reminisces on Christmas times in his youth as he looks at all the decorations on the Christmas tree. It's a good short read if you've already read A Christmas Carol. There are, of course, 4 other Christmas novellas, of which I intended to read another one this year, but chose this instead. Numbers 97 through 99 were the Faraway Tree trilogy by Enid Blyton. The Enchanted Wood, The Magic Faraway Tree, and The Folk of the Faraway Tree. Again, absolute classics of British children's literature that I just didn't grow up with. The Magic Faraway Tree is also on the BBC's Big Read list. I actually wasn't too sure about these to begin with, given they're for rather young children, and they definitely have the golly gee feel of post-war mid-20th century children's literature, but I have to admit, I really enjoyed them. Pure, ridiculous, nonsensical fun. A sort of Alice in Wonderland feel with fantastic characters like Moonface and the Saucepan Man. And my very first Enid Blyton's to boot. And just in time for the new film. And finally, number 100. I was trying to figure out what to round off the year and this challenge with, but when my husband gifted me a book for Christmas, very much out of character, as usually I buy my own books, I had to read that. Diddly Squat, Home to Roost by Jeremy Clarkson. I have very mixed views on Clarkson as a person, but I have to admit, my husband and I love watching Clarkson's Farm. Not to mention the Grand Tour, Top Gear, etc. This book is one of, I guess, 5 books now, which are really compilations of his newspaper columns. It was a good companion to watching Clarkson's Farm, adding and expanding a bit onto some of the things in the show, but as expected, I did read it with mixed feelings. He makes very good points about the farming industry, and it's great that he's giving them such a strong voice in these ever harder times. But he does have a tendency to jump to hyperbole at the drop of a hat, especially when discussing political leanings. Still, a quick and enjoyable read to round out the end of the year. And there we are, 100 books. For you number nerds, some brief stats. The shortest book I read was 16 pages. The longest book I read was 528 pages. Total pages read were 18,144, making the average book length 181 pages. Out of the 100 books, 73 were physical books versus 27 audiobooks, with a breakdown of 73 fiction books and 27 non-fiction. A coincidence of numbers. Most of the audiobooks were in fact non-fiction, but not all, so the two did not entirely coincide. Of the 73 fiction books, 27 were adult novels, 2 YA novels, 25 middle grade children's novels, 1 children's picture book, 13 short stories and collections, 12 poetry collections, and 7 plays. I want to note as well that I'm rather proud of myself for reading 8 brand new books that only came out this year. Sunrise on the Reaping, Careless People, The Hive, The World According to Kunk, Nobody's Girl, Alice with a Y, You Want to Be on Top, and Eleanor. Strong female character, Unruly, and the Diddly Squat book were 2024, so still not bad. Normally I'm way behind the times in my reading. I am a second-hand bookseller after all. Looking at those new titles though, there were the 3 titles I pre-ordered, which I read physically. All the rest were spontaneous audiobook choices. I mean, even 3 pre-orders is still pretty high for me. Well, technically 4 since I ordered 2 copies of this, but I think being an audiobook consumer is actually doing me a lot of good, in terms of bringing me to new titles more than I otherwise would. So, for anyone who criticizes audiobooks, and I'll admit I used to be one of them, they definitely have their place and benefit. So, favorites, least favorites, let's do a quick breakdown before I wrap up this very long video. Favorite poetry book goes to Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit by Jen Campbell. Favorite play is either Peter and Alice or Night Mother. I think Night Mother was the best play I read, but I'm so fond of Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland that I knew that it would be an instant favorite. Favorite short story? The Yellow Wallpaper is definitely a favorite, but it was a reread, so it's hard to rank fairly. The Pit and the Pendulum and The Judge's House from The Burial of the Rats were also great. Favorite middle grade children's book is either Alice with a Y or The Invention of Hugo Cabret. Both really impressed me and brought me a lot of joy. Favorite young adult book? I can't decide between Sunrise on the Reaping and The Hive. Whilst both new stories, I feel Sunrise has an unfair advantage, being a book in a series I already love, and an excellent addition at that. So I'm gonna say they were a tie. When The Swarm comes out, the recently announced sequel to The Hive, it will probably enjoy the same advantage. Non-fiction is actually really hard because I read so many that were so poignant and important, but not necessarily something that I would choose as a favorite that particularly resonated with me. I find a similar issue with watching films. Some you can acknowledge are extraordinary, groundbreaking, or culturally important films that you know you will ever only watch once, whilst others that are less important but strike some sort of chord with you end up being go-to favorites. The most eye-opening was probably Careless People, but in terms of my 3 favorites in that they resonated with me the most, not that they were necessarily objectively the best. The Anthropocene Reviewed, Quiet, and... oh dear, where are you? The Book of Secrets. Maybe. Once Upon a Tome was also brilliant and personally relevant. Very hard to pick. Favorite adult novel? Well, The Woman in Black. It just hit that sweet spot for me. Herland was a surprisingly good read as well. And least favorite read of the year? Oh, come here, you. A Room with a View. The Queen and I gets a dishonorable mention as well because of the disappointing ending. So, what's on the agenda for 2026? I'm definitely not putting any hard number goals on myself ever again. I'm also very keen to read some longer books this year that I have been itching to read of late. But I do have a couple of new reading goals I'm working towards in a low pressure way. As a subset of my life goals list, some of my friends and I, who are all the same age, decided at the beginning of 2025 to each make a 40 before 40 list. We were all 35 at the time, as I still am currently, so basically 40 things we would like to accomplish within the next 5 years. One of mine was this 100 book goal, so that is now completed, but I also included on my 40 before 40 completing one of the book lists on my original life goals list. I think the most reasonable one for me at this point in my life is to read all of the books on BBC's The Big Read list. I've already read 37 of the 100 books on that list, one of them being The Magic Faraway Tree I read this year, and so many of the books on my urgent TBR happen to be on this list, so it makes the most sense to me. It also includes plenty of children's books, which I love reading in between thick, heavy literature. Another life goal read I'm already working through this year is reading the entire Bible. I've read many parts of the Bible throughout my life, from being raised Christian and from school and university studying it as culture and literature, but I've never read the entire Bible cover to cover. I am no longer religious, so I am approaching this from a cultural and literature standpoint, and therefore reading the King James Version, as it had such a huge influence on the world, despite not at all being the most accurate English translation. I already like listening to podcasts and YouTube videos to get scholarly takes on translations, so this is serving a different purpose. And in a very un-me move, I am reading it via ebook on my Remarkable Paper Pro so that I can highlight and annotate it without my inner secondhand bookseller wanting to yell at me. But I've set myself up with one of those Bible in a year plans, ticking off different passages to read every day. So far, so good. It's been very reasonable. I was expecting to have to read a lot more each day than it has ended up being so far. But also, if I end up falling behind, I'll just keep plodding through the schedule as and when I can. I'm not pressuring myself to actually get the whole thing read in exactly 1 year, just to get through the whole thing. I am currently swapping between Genesis and Matthew, both of which I've read multiple times before, as well as dipping into some Psalms and Proverbs. Editing Jess here. I have actually finished Genesis now, and I'm in the middle of Job, as well as continuing on with Matthew and Psalms and Proverbs. But that's really it for 2026. I am currently reading The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of those classics I've wanted to read for ages but kept putting off. I actually started The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab first, but I don't think it's quite the right timing for me for this one. Sometimes you just feel a book is perfect at a given time, and other times you feel it's a book for another time. I don't have any audiobooks currently on the go, but as my husband and I are in the middle of a Gilmore Girls marathon, his first watch, my second, I am very tempted by Kelly Bishop's memoir, The Third Gilmore Girl. I can't believe I didn't twig until recently that she was the original Sheila in a chorus line. I knew her voice was familiar, and now I'm just yabbering. So if you made it this far, thank you so much. Let me know in the comments what you're reading, what you read in 2025, any recommendations you have, any reading goals or challenges you are undertaking, or, any kind words for the world in these highly stressful times. A big thank you to my current 8,931 subscribers, as well as all other fellow bookworms, collectors, and nerdy human beings watching, and anyone joining in from the future. Also, if you enjoy my content and wish to see more of it, you can support my channel by leaving me a one-off tip at ko-fi.com/squirrelynerdyjess, or leave me a super thanks here on YouTube. There is absolutely no pressure to do either of these. I expect absolutely nothing. Do the YouTube things if you feel like it. I will say subscribe, just in case it makes the button do the fun thing. Now that this reading challenge is complete, I plan to give a lot more attention to my channel, especially considering I have about half a dozen videos already filmed that just need editing. This reading challenge required me to prioritize a great deal of my free time, which is why I was so quiet here most of the year, aside from some short videos recently. But hopefully that will change. We shall see. Life is crazy, but that is at least my intention. Until next time, be kind, be curious, be authentic, and effective. Bye!
The absolute chaos of about 5.5 hours of filming.
I had in mind... Hold that thought. He has also written a few books about philosophy and the concept... Philosophy? I keep saying philosophy. Please do not touch please do not touch this exhibit. Because it is filled with many... Ooh! Total madness!